We live our daily lives in modern homes, surrounded by the comfortable trappings of life in the 21st century. When we want to understand the way our ancestors lived, we head to a museum. So to experience colonial America, for example, you might take a tour of Williamsburg, Virginia, where you can walk through 18th century spaces. But what if you had the chance to actually live in a museum? To wake up in the morning with the sun slanting in your bedroom window, just as it did for the occupants over 250 years ago. To feel the radiant warmth from the evening fireplace as you read a book or share a conversation, just as people have done in rooms like this since long before we became a country, and yet to still enjoy all the domestic conveniences of modern life. To stay at Wilton is to live in modern comfort in a museum of history. Welcome to Wilton House. My name is Stephen Foster. You know, Wilton House may just be the best preserved colonial plantation house in all of Virginia. And that's just one reason why I want to invite you and your friends or family to spend a week or a weekend in this rich historical property. Does living in the museum sound intriguing to you? Well then, let me tell you just a little bit about the rich history of Wilton. By the second half of the 18th century, the Churchill family had already been in Tidewater, Virginia for 3 generations. The family had risen to prominence and prosperity, owning some 6,000 acres of land, most of it between the Rappahannock and the Piankatank rivers, about 40 miles north of the colonial capital of Williamsburg. On this extensive property, about a half a mile from the Piankatank River, William Churchill built a stately manor house he called Wilton. The date of completion, etched into the structure, was 1763. Archaeologist Thane Harpole has done extensive research on early Virginia plantations.
In 1770, the landscape of Wilton was probably a very well-developed plantation landscape. I mean, at that point, this part of Middlesex County had been inhabited by English colonists for 120 years. So, you know, in terms of being a area where the fields have all been cleared, it's all in full production. You know, this is a built-up landscape. It's going to look like, you know, they were emulating the landscapes of England. You know, most of the people that are building these houses are justices of the peace, they're the leaders of the church, they're the burgesses, you know, they're members of the governor's council. So there's a lot of things that are tied up in, you know, the look and feel of these houses is very tied very closely to the look and feel of churches and courthouses, and bringing all those elements of kind of economic power, political power, and even spiritual power together, so that, you know, when people see these buildings or interact with the buildings, they know that they're interacting with someone who's important, or who's powerful, that they have to defer to.
But as is so often the case with the structures we build, early elegance gave way to a long period of decline. Wilton went from a grand plantation house for a prominent member of the Tidewater gentry to a crumbling dwelling for a series of small farmers. When Charles Palmer, the last of the farmers at Wilton, died in 1929, Wilton was a decaying colonial wreck at risk of vanishing from the landscape. Luckily, in 1940, an unlikely savior appeared. Gerald Ballantyne, an antiques dealer from Ohio, was looking up and down the eastern seaboard for an old house as a base of operations and a storage facility for his antiques business. He purchased Wilton House and some 400 surrounding acres. The Ballantynes halted the slow deterioration of Wilton. The family had modest resources, but Gerald Ballantyne, and 2 subsequent generations of Ballantines, believed strongly that nothing should be done to radically alter the house. They performed needed maintenance, buttressed failing timbers, all the while religiously respecting its unrivaled historical integrity. But by the year 2000, the family was ready to cede the burdens of maintaining Wilton to someone else. Preservation Virginia stepped in and eagerly acquired the property. Gordon Lohr of Preservation Virginia was instrumental in the acquisition.
When I lived in Richmond in 1965, 66, I saw an advertisement for an auction, and I threw my wife in the car and we raced down here and pulled up, and I went, oh my God, there's got to be one of the best looking houses I've ever seen. So I've been by this house many times over the years, and when I took the job as the revolving fund director, I thought, here's a house we ought to save. And it took quite a while, but it was worth the effort.
Preservation Virginia then set out to find a new owner who could restore Wilton to some of its early stately elegance and ensure its survival in authentic form. I can remember very well the first time I saw Wilton. It was an image in a Preservation Virginia online sales brochure. At the time, I couldn't quite believe that this remarkable old house had not yet found a buyer, and it didn't really seem at the time that the eventual buyer would be me. 7 years later, in 2011, a recent widower and with an itch to take on a new project, I took the plunge and bought Wilton. The challenge was to preserve what was here at Wilton: the early materials, the early paint, old floor, plaster walls, while rehabilitating it for use as a residence. Chuck Rackley was the man for that job.
The project was, I believe, about 2 years that we were here. We initially started, I believe, with the exterior of the house as far as doing the masonry part of the house. All of the windows, actually sashes, had come out of the house. We pulled them, took them back to the shop, and pulled all the glass and renovated and preserved them. Then the biggest part interior was probably the plaster part of the house, doing all the plaster repairs and then actually replastering over what had been taken out and doing the ceilings. It's probably not an inch of this house that we haven't touched. It was probably one of the best restorations as far as results, as feeling like a museum house that I've worked on. It was just astonishing to come in and just see the house, you know, after it's done, and what was actually not done to the house, probably more than anything, just hands off, you know, not touching a lot of the house and leaving things alone, and that really give it such a great feel.
But when it came to the remarkable early paint surfaces at Wilton, some of them dating back 250 years, even Chuck, with his more than 30 years of experience with old houses, was stuck. So we called in expert paint conservator Chris Mills.
As a paint conservator, we consolidate finishes generally, or we would reinstate them as they were. Wilton, to me, it still is my favorite project, and I mean that. You couldn't do what you did at Wilton somewhere else. Like, I work in a lot of house museums where you have fragments of color, and generally the protocol is they're putting it back to the way that it was during that period. So the visitor's experience would be that they're experiencing these finishes as it was, which is very different from Wilton. Wilton has original finishes in it. This has an integrity about all of Wilton, just has a haunting sense of authenticity to it.
Everywhere you look today at Wilton, you can see the results of the expert craftsmanship and the skilled labor of Chuck Rackley, Chris Mills, and many, many others. That's why when you come to visit Wilton, you will find materials and the look and feel of the house that was built here in 1763. All told, Wilton Plantation House is one of the great authentic survivors from Colonial Virginia. Julie Langan of the Virginia Department of Historic Resources is the state of Virginia's Historic Preservation Officer.
My first impression when I finally saw Wilton, I can think back to that day. It was damp and drizzly, and I was really looking forward. I felt a sense of anticipation to finally be visiting. And I remember arriving at the front door and being welcomed into the hallway and thinking, just looking around and thinking, wow, this was worth the wait. And as I visited the front rooms and saw the woodwork and the paneling and the fact that they hadn't been painted over and that the craftsmanship was really respected to the point that it was the centerpiece of the room. I couldn't think of another project quite like it that I had had the privilege of visiting. From just an architectural historian's perspective, the integrity of this place really sets it apart from many others.
And it's not just the architecture that makes Wilton special. It's the multi-sensory aura of history that inhabits every room. Holly Horton is director of the Middlesex County Museum.
It's a sensory piece. It's the smells, it's the sounds, it's the textures of the natural woods, of the plaster, of the high ceilings, the way the light comes through the windows, multiple pane. It's not just one thing that's very different from our life of today. It's all of it put together in one little package that makes it so very special, of stepping back in time.
I hope this short video has given you some small sense of what a special place Wilton is. Thanks for watching, and we hope you can come to experience Wilton in person very soon.
I think a family traveling to Virginia who would have the opportunity to stay at Wilton would expand and enhance their visitor experience exponentially. And I think that because it would make the whole experience feel more real, more authentic, and they would feel like they're living the past and living history. And especially if that family has children, I could see that being a memory that stayed with them the rest of their lives.